They finally discovered life on Mars and instantly regretted it. This one is shot in space. They say this is the International Space Station, Mars Pilgrim 7 mission, day 1. We're inside the space station and a woman introduces herself as Miranda North, quarantine officer on board the International Space Station. She says today, the Pilgrim capsule with its valuable Mars soil samples completes its 8-month return from Mars. Preparing to receive these samples has been the purpose of our mission these last few months, but the Pilgrim capsule is damaged. Basically, a guy named Rory Adams is now risking his life to save the capsule. That's Rory right there being strapped up before he's released into space. The rest of the guys are floating about trying to get everything ready. A lady counts down and a man presses a button, after which the space station starts vibrating. They're communicating with Rory and looking at him from the window. You can tell Rory is a little nervous. Then something starts moving really quickly towards him from space. And boom, there's a collision. After that, they don't hear anything from Rory for a few seconds. But he's only pulling their legs. He actually got what they needed. Everybody's happy and relieved. Rory heads back to the station. Day 2 of the Pilgrim 7 mission. We see someone doing some tests on a rat, and it appears that the result is telling them that the life on Mars is similar to life on Earth. After about 3 minutes of observation, the thing they're observing finally moves, and Hugh says, "We're looking at the first incontrovertible proof of life beyond Earth." They're all smiling and looking at the thing like it's a newborn baby. Next, we see Kat, the mission commander, talking with some kids from Earth via video call. The kids are asking questions I can't even comprehend. Guys, the results are in. I'm not smarter than a 5th grader. Anyway, Kat goes around and introduces the kids to all the guys. David is the space OG. He has been here for 473 straight days. He's a doctor. The newbie is Miranda. She's a doctor that works with the CDC, and you can tell she's new because she's still bubbling with life compared to David, who seems to be so sick of everything. Finally, one of the kids asks a question I'd ask. How do they go to the toilet? And shows them how that works. Hugh, also a doctor, shows them how to eat a pea in space, then asks them if they've got a name for the cell yet. This kid, Dominic, reveals that they decided to name it after their school, Calvin. By the way, they're making this call from outside Times Square. Back at the space station, Miranda's doing some tests on David, and I think I'm sensing some chemistry between these two. Or should I say some physics since they're in space? Anyway, David starts talking about how he prefers to be in space rather than Earth. He's remembering his time in the military when they'd go to Syria and set up hospitals, treat the locals, and in say 2 weeks, the whole place would end up bombed up. He's getting emotional. He says he can't stand what humans do to each other on Earth. Boy, you are so right. I might actually consider coming to meet you up there soon. I'm tired of this bitch of an Earth. Miranda's trying to get his spirits up. She's reminding him of things he could possibly miss from Earth. Now the conversation moves to Hugh and Kat. She congratulates him on the new achievement, and Hugh says these are the greatest days of his life, but he wishes he had a time machine so he could visit his 10-year-old self who wanted out of the wheelchair. Anyway, they all go to bed. Fast forward to day 12. Of course, more tests on Calvin. What else would they be doing in space anyway? He was the one on the microscope as usual, and everyone just keeps saying it's fascinating. Maybe I'd have understood what's fascinating if I had paid more attention in science class, but it's too late now. Anyway, Hugh says Calvin now possesses the means to interact with this environment, including the use of what appears to be proto-appendages. I didn't understand what that meant at first, but this demonstration really helped. Little Calvin is really reaching out with his little appendages. Miranda notices how it's approaching and not retreating. Hugh says its curiosity outweighs its fear. David thinks it's beautiful. Well, beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder, I suppose. Okay, wait a minute. This might actually be beautiful. I mean, look at Calvin moving like a balloon man. Rory jokes that he was going to be a daddy. It's a happy day at the space station. They're all hanging around, joking and laughing, but Cho is somewhere else watching his wife give birth. Thankfully, the delivery is successful, and he introduces his newborn to the guys. That's 2 new fathers in one day. Great day, isn't it? He was now with his own son, Calvin. Calvin latches onto his finger, and next thing, we start hearing a siren. The guys rush to the lab. Smoke is coming out from a machine. Rory fixes it, but Miranda's confused as to why that even happened in the first place. She says nothing in that lab can malfunction. Hugh says it's all on him, so Miranda starts scolding him. She tells him not to go into the lab without proper rest, and not to come out without triple checking everything. He's taking all the roasting until she compares Calvin to a poison outbreak. He was not having that. Roy says there's nobody else who can do Hugh's job, pretty much begs him to do better. Rory admits that he's not qualified to even be around Calvin, and he doesn't want to have to. Oh, by the way, he hates that Hugh keeps calling it Calvin. Come on, Rory. Respect Hugh's little boy. Miranda says this isn't and will never be a controlled experiment, so let's just agree that we made our first and last mistake. After she says that, Rory says he misses his dog and leaves. But looking at Hugh's face, you can tell that this may be the first mistake, but it is very unlikely to be the last. Later that night, Miranda is writing in her diary that, after weeks of stunning growth and activity, Calvin is completely inactive. She says it's probably due to the clamp failure in the lab. The working theory is that Calvin's hibernation may be a defense mechanism. She notes that everyone is on edge while Hugh is beating himself up about it. She, however, is low-key relieved because she says Calvin was growing very fast. Finally, she says the books in the lab must stay sealed no matter the risk to Calvin. Now we see Hugh continue to beat himself up about the whole thing, while Miranda massages his legs and tries to comfort him. Hugh says he's toying with the idea of stimulating it electrically. Miranda says it's not her call. But, well, next thing we see is Hugh in the process of stimulating Calvin. That look on Rory's face just tells you he doesn't want to be here at all. Hugh says they're seeing under what conditions it re-engages with this environment, as he puts his hands into the opening. openings. He shocks him twice. Nothing happens. Rory says it's probably dead, but Hugh is sure it's not. It's just in a deep sleep, like me after a bowl of pasta. He shocks it again, and that's enough to jerk Calvin out of sleep. And boy, Calvin really hates being woken up from sleep, because it immediately wraps itself around Hugh's hand, and even breaks the wand. Hugh says the grip feels like a really firm handshake. He tries to pull out his hand from the glove, but that's not working. Rory offers to go in there and pull the thing off, but Kat says no. They have to remain in quarantine. She suggests that Hugh try to distract it, so he picks up the wand and tries to distract Calvin with it. It doesn't work. He prefers Hugh's hand. In fact, the attempt at distraction makes things even worse. It's gripping tighter now and squeezing. It looks like it's breaking Hugh's hand now. At this point, Rory is shouting to Kat to allow him to go in, but she's still insisting. The argument is broken up when they notice that Hugh has gone quiet. His hand is out now and it has been completely wrung out. Calvin enters the glove and tries to break out, but it can't. It's very determined though. So it goes back inside, picks up the wand, uses it to puncture the glove, and then breaks free. It goes straight for the imprisoned rat and completely squeezes the life out of it in a matter of seconds. Rory sees this and just opens the door and goes in to get Hugh out. He manages to get him out, but he doesn't get himself out. Calvin, who has grown bigger after sucking the life out of the rat, wraps itself around Rory's foot, and the rest of the guys close the door on him. Kat explains that she can't let him out. Rory understands. Calvin is wrapping itself around Rory's leg, so Rory picks up something to burn it. It works because Calvin quickly gets off and far from him. Rory now asks for permission to clap the thing. I'm wondering why he even needs permission when it's threatening his life. Anyway, Kat gives him the permission and Sho suggests he uses an incinerator. That doesn't work though. It's flying all over the place like a fire-resistant Spider-Man. Then boom, it disappears. Rory starts looking for it, then out of nowhere, it comes from behind him and enters his mouth. David is really shouting for the door to be open at this point, but you know, protocol is protocol. But it's too late anyway because in seconds, Rory is dead. Due to death. Floating in a pool of his own blood. If that was the end, it would have even been okay. But the incinerator is still on, and so the air vents open up. Shortly after, Calvin comes out of Rory's mouth and it's so much bigger now. It's trying to get out through the vents. Sho, by the way, is saying the system is not allowing him access. Kat tells him to just shut it down. Sho is shutting the vents one by one as Calvin hops from one to the other. But just before the last one shuts down, it squeezes itself inside. It could be anywhere now. For now, they take Rory's body and wrap it up, and someone suggests that they need to reestablish quarantine. Kat does a distress call out, but while she's still on the call, they lose communication with Earth. The transmitter has failed and they have to go outside to access it and get Earth back online. Kat gets strapped up and then goes out to get it fixed. She's out there now and she says it's overheated. She opens a valve and after a few seconds, Calvin comes out and wraps itself around her. Life on Mars should have really just remained on Mars. She manages to close the valve though, just as Calvin is trying to get in her suit, so Sho tells her to meet David at the airlock. As she's making her way there, she notices some liquid in her helmet. She suspects Calvin has broken her coolant tube. She says Calvin is squeezing harder. The liquid in the helmet is blocking her vision, so she says she doesn't have time and has to jump. She does jump, but Calvin holds tight. She can barely see anything now. Miranda says Kat is drowning, so David is strapping up, and he keeps strapping up even though Sho says there isn't enough protection and it is going to hurt. He meets Kat at the airlock, and they're trying to open the valve together, but Kat figures she can't make it, so she starts pulling the lever the wrong way to make sure David can't open it. David watches her tap out. She literally sacrificed her life so Calvin doesn't get back in, but as she's floating away in space, we see Calvin detach from her and jump back to the space station. David is in tears, Sho is in tears, everyone is in tears. Check carefully, you just might be in tears too. Hugh says they may have an opportunity here. Calvin can't live much longer out there, so they're now checking to be sure that there's no valve or opening through which Calvin can get back in. Oh wait, the thrusters. They're now paying attention so they can find out which thruster nozzle Calvin is about to enter, so they can blast it off. David sees Calvin jet across and Hugh notices the temperature on the thruster 2 move and Sho fires. Then thruster 3, then 5, and they fire both times. But after the third time, fuel gets low. Sho says they'll reach the atmosphere soon if he doesn't get them back to stable, and he'll need the rest of the fuel to do that. Miranda says if it's between letting Calvin back in here and letting it down there, they'd have to let it back in, and so they do. Hugh has an idea, so they head off to try and seal everywhere and deprive the thing of life support. They're sealing everywhere, but Hugh doesn't look like he's very okay. Now they're all just waiting, and David is talking about how hard it is to watch people die. He says it's like fireworks. I for one like those, but okay. Why do I feel like he's about to watch another person get clapped pretty soon? Sooner than you expect, actually. Hugh cuts in and starts blaming himself for everything, so Miranda basically just tells him it's nobody's fault. Getting this thing on board was a risk from the beginning. Hugh says life's very existence requires destruction. He says Calvin doesn't exactly hate them. He just has to clap them in order to survive. Oh, but that sure looks like pure hatred to me. After Hugh says that, he just sort of taps out. They're trying to get him back with the defibrillator, but it's not working at first. It later does though, but as he wakes up, Miranda notices something moving in his leg. She opens it up and it's Calvin. How the hell did he get in there? Miranda uses the defibrillator on it, and the thing now detaches from Hugh, and we see the face of this monster. The three of them immediately take off. David and Miranda manage to get into a room and lock themselves in, but Sho knows he can't make it, so he opts to hide in his sleeping sleeping pod. Calvin is looking for a way to get in, but he can't find a way, so it leaves. I have a feeling it'll be back soon, though. Since Calvin is nowhere in sight, David and Miranda come out of the room and head back to meet Hugh. He isn't dead yet, but he seems like he doesn't have much longer. He tells them to let him go. They do, and he flatlines. Miranda can't hold back her tears. She says she feels pure hate for Calvin, and then they start hearing a beep and seeing a red dot moving around on the screen. Calvin seems to have swallowed something from Hugh's leg, so now they can track him, and they literally see it make its way to Hugh's body, wrap itself around him, and put a limb in his mouth. Then Calvin lifts its head and sights Miranda and David and heads towards them, but they manage to shut the door fast enough. David now says, "Let's kill this thing," and I'm right there with him. As they're trying to figure out how, they see something heading to them. At first they think it's people from Earth coming to rescue them, but Miranda figures they're not here to rescue. They're here to push them out to deep space because they can't risk Calvin reaching Earth. At this point, Sho comes out of his pod and makes his way to the cabin. He grabs a tool, opens the door, and Calvin rushes out to the astronauts out there. Calvin takes care of them really quickly and turns back inside to grab hold of Sho's leg. Miranda grabs his hand and tries to pull him back in, but Calvin climbs through Sho's body and nearly latches onto Miranda's hand. So Sho grabs the thing and pulls it towards itself, and they're both sucked out into space. Wait a minute, actually just Sho is sucked into space. Calvin is back in the station and coming for Miranda and David, but the pair manage to make it back inside and they lock the doors. From the windows, they can see stuff getting destroyed. Everything is going up in flames and down in pieces. David says they're losing life support, and they probably have 2 hours left. They don't think they'll survive. It's getting really cold now. They seem to just be waiting to die at this point. David grabs a children's lullaby book, and he remembers that his father used to read it to him. They're both crying now while they reminisce about their younger days with their dads. Can't relate. My dad never came back with the milk. As David is saying goodnight to the moon and stars and everything, an idea pops into his head. Calvin needs oxygen to survive, but since oxygen is low on the rest of the ship, they could use the oxygen candles as bait and try to trap it in a lifeboat and float into deep space. That way, they save the Earth. But basically, David has to sacrifice himself so that Miranda can make it back to Earth. They get suited up and David gets to work. He's floating around with his oxygen candle, but still no sign of Calvin yet. He's only startled by Rory's body, but soon after that, Calvin shows up and wraps itself around the candle. David then runs further away and leaves another candle for Calvin to wrap itself around, and it very well obliges. He does that until he gets into the lifeboat and straps himself up. Then finally, Calvin comes and latches onto him. He holds the candle up and Calvin moves to the candle and wraps itself around it. David now closes the door and prepares to fly the lifeboat. He disconnects from the station and starts flying into deep space, while Miranda heads back to Earth. On her way back, she records a message in case she dies upon re-entry. She gives an account of what happened and how the creature clapped 4 astronauts and the 5th, David, is carrying it out to deep space. She demands that all of her colleagues be honored for giving their lives to this course. She also tells them that Mars life form should be considered hostile, and she warns them not to underestimate their intelligence and adaptive abilities. Finally, she says if the creature ever reaches Earth, they must do everything to destroy it, or they'd be risking all human life. As she's saying this, we see Calvin begin to wrap itself around David. Then we see the lifeboat start going in opposite directions. We now see Calvin meticulously open up David's helmet, and then just when it's about to take a lunge for his face, we cut out to space. We now see Miranda heading back to Earth. Oh, this is how astronauts get back to Earth? Interesting. She lands in the sea and the fishermen there head straight to her. And wait a goddamn minute, that's the wrong one. That's David's lifeboat. Miranda's boat is the one spiraling into deep space. David is trying to tell the man not to open it, but they can't even hear him. They open it. Oh, this is not good. That's where the movie ends? Oh wow. They named this one life, but it's more like death. Moral of the story? You can't spell life without death, I think. Anyway, subscribe. We're almost at 1 million.